Can you hear me? Yes. I want to say hi to everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I want to sort of just give a quick 5-minute sense of what I'm about to do. First, I'm going to explore the notion of the pandemic as a political and basically ideological issue. And then I'm going to move from that to talk basically about the importance of critical pedagogy being central to politics. And then I'm going to talk more specifically about what it means to take education as a moral and political project seriously in terms of our own responsibilities as intellectuals and as educators and as artists and as cultural workers. So with that said, let me begin. We currently live in a world that resembles a dystopian novel that could only be imagined as a harrowing work of fiction or biting political commentary. The works of George Orwell, Ray Bradbury, and Sinclair Lewis now appear as an understatement in a world marked by horrifying political horizons, a world in which fascistic and medical pandemics merge. In this age of uncertainty, time and space have collapsed into a gulf of shared apprehensions, relentless anxieties, and the possibilities of an authoritarian abyss. As medical pandemics merge with the plague of state and corporate violence, the terrors of everyday life point to a world that is in some ways has begun to descend into darkness. Death and sickness haunt our existence as the pandemic spreads through those establishments, spaces, and materials that impact on the most intimate aspects of our daily lives. Images of fear, if not apocalyptic visions, flood the news as increasing numbers of people either get sick or die from the COVID-19 virus. We can no longer shake hands, embrace our friends, feel safe in public transportation, or sit inside a restaurant or a movie theater. Doorknobs, counters, the breath we inhale, and anything else that offers the virus a resting place is comparable to a ticking bomb ready to explode, resulting in massive suffering and untold deaths. Long-term stretches of self-isolation confine the privileged to the safety of their homes or protected workplaces. On the other hand, for the poor, disadvantaged, incarcerated, and elderly, there are no safe places, only the daily risk of contamination, sickness, or worse. Amid this collective terror, the architecture of authoritarianism has resurfaced with a vengeance, especially in the United States, in the form of a waking nightmare with a cast of horrors. Surveillance technologies proliferate, armed militia defend groups refusing to wear protective masks, and intimidate those who do. Voter suppression laws are pushed by right-wing Republican politicians. Conspiracy theories displace logic and reason, and mass shootings become routinized, suggesting that violence has become a normal part of everyday life. The COVID-19 plague points to more than a medical pandemic and must be understood within a more comprehensive historical, political, and ideological context. The COVID-19 crisis is deeply rooted in years of neglect by neoliberal governments that denied the importance of public health, the public good, and the welfare state, while defunding institutions that made them possible. The current pandemic cannot be separated or removed from the crisis of massive inequalities in wealth, income, and power that have grown relentlessly since the 1970s. None of these issues can be separated from broader struggles for social equality, economic justice, and democracy. Nor can the current pandemic be disconnected from a crisis of democratic values, critical education, and the civic imagination. Underlying the current magnitude of the current pandemics we now face is the crucial question, what kind of world do we want to live in today? And what kind of society do we want to build for future generations? The COVID-19 pandemic has revealed the ugly and cruel face of a predatory neoliberal capitalism intent on restoring class power and consolidating the rapid concentration of capital. It is wedded to the privatization of public services, driven by a survival of the fittest ethos, and it tears up all forms of social obligation. Under neoliberalism, everything is for sale, and the only obligation of citizenship is consumerism. Neoliberalism ignores basic human needs, such as quality healthcare, decent wages, available childcare, and free quality education for all. It views government as the enemy of the market, limits society to the realm of the family and individuals, and embraces a fixed hedonism and challenges the very idea of the public good. All we have to do is remember Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan sort of mimicking this notion that there's no such thing as society, only individuals. And Ronald Reagan saying government is not the solution, it's the problem. I think we can surmise what that has meant in the last 50 years. Under neoliberalism, economic activity is divorced from social cost, while policies that produce racial cleansing, militarism, and staggering levels of inequality in wealth and power constitute an updated form of fascist politics that I have labeled as neoliberal fascism. This is a worldview that argues that the market should govern not only the economy, but all aspects of society. Its ultimate purpose is the concentration of wealth in the hands of a financial elite. Neoliberal fascism combines the harshest elements of a cutthroat capitalism with an unabashed embrace of white nationalism and white supremacy. Think about what's going on, particularly in the United States, with a Republican Party that is now basically not only pushing tax cuts for the rich and benefits for the rich, but openly proclaims its allegiance to voter suppression and white supremacy. Is that the market cannot provide basic social provisions and meet public health needs. The market's anti-public and anti-democratic ethos is at odds with the crucial demands of civic leadership and government responsibility, given its long-standing belief that the needs of capital should take priority over human needs. Not surprisingly, over time, public goods have withered and begun to fail. That is, the publicly owned bones of society, public education, public health system, roads, bridges, levees, water systems have been underfunded and pushed to the breaking point of despair and dysfunctionality in many countries. Drained of civic values and lacking a commanding vision, the central institutions of liberal democracy have atrophied, undermining not only civic obligations and informed and engaged citizenry, but also historical memory and the public's capacity to discern the truth from falsehoods. Neoliberalism is not just an economic system, but also an ideological and cultural system that functions as a powerful educational force. Its presence is on display daily in the rise of the corporate-controlled social media that have accelerated a culture of surveillance, consumption, distraction, immediacy, and the spectacles of violence and extremism. What is new about the current historical moment is that the attack on the welfare state, common good, and those considered disposable is increasingly legitimated, it seems to me, through oppressive forms of education in a variety of spaces and cultural forms, whether we're talking about newspapers, social media, magazines, and popular culture. This merging of culture, power, and politics represents a new stage in the development of capitalist society, one in which left-leaning and mainstream cultural apparatuses, from schools to the digital media, are now under attack, while the right-wing media pushes authoritarian impulses and minority rule, displacing the necessity of tanks or massive displays of state repression with the colonizing of mass consciousness. Of course, there are exceptions to this. Authoritarian populism and economic nationalism are now normalized in an anti-democratic culture that is constructed partly through the grammar of oppressive forms of education and the struggle over consciousness, agency, and values in a number of diverse sites. This updated neoliberal landscape is defined through a pandemic of willful ignorance, the disdain of science, the repudiation of evidence, expert advice, and a deep disregard for the truth. Moreover, this culture of denial, with its contempt for evidence, justice, and democracy, has not only been reinforced and reciprocated in the highest levels of government, but has also been endlessly reiterated by powerful conservative, traditional, and social media outlets. One result is that the distinction between fact and fiction disappear, and somewhere along the way, the democratization of the flow of information becomes the democratization of the flow of disinformation. We live in a world of disimagination machines. Lost here is a critical language capable of producing a narrative that promotes shared values and enables people to develop the sustained connections crucial, in my estimation, to a vibrant democracy. Oppressive forms of education have now become the central elements of an America, a United States, particularly threatened by a number of pandemics that endanger human life and the planet itself. The propaganda machines of the right-wing media echo the former Trump regime's support for disparaged ideas, lies about testing, fake cures for the virus, all the while engaging in a politics of evasion and denial that covered up both Trump's incompetence and the machineries of violence, greed, and terminal exclusion at the core of a society that believes that the public sphere is exclusively reserved for whites, that everyone should fend for themselves, and that commercial values are the only values worth supporting. The coronavirus pandemic now works in tandem with corporate media conglomerates to produce identities narrowly defined by market values, while normalizing a stripped-down notion of individual responsibility that convinces people that whatever problems they face, they have no one to blame but themselves. To me, this is one of the most powerful educational ideological forces now governing neoliberal societies. In this logic, individual interests are the only reality that really matters, and those interests are purely monetary. In addition, this market ideology operates under the false, depoliticizing assumption that there are only individual solutions to socially produced problems. This ideology reinforces states of individual alienation and isolation, while it increasingly renders human beings numb, fearful, and immune to the demands of economic and social justice. Dealing with life's problems becomes a solitary affair, reducing matters of social responsibility to a regressive and depoliticized notion of individual choice. In this instance, the political becomes regressively personal, rendering difficult any critical understanding of wider systemic forces while undermining any viable notion of critical agency and collective resistance. As the connection between democracy and education withers, hope becomes the enemy of agency, and agency is reduced to learning how to survive, rather than working to shape the conditions that bear down on one's life and society in general. This paralyzing form of depoliticization, with its refiguring of the social sphere, individual responsibility, historical memory, critical thinking, and collective identity, reinforces an acute indifference, misdirected rage, withdrawal from public life, and a disdain for politics, democratic politics, often contributing to the loss of the habits of critical and engaged citizenship. The COVID-19 crisis has produced an age of uncertainty, fragmentation, it seems to me, and isolation. Within this, the crisis of ideas is not matched, or the crisis of economics is not matched by a crisis of ideas. The COVID-19 plague has produced an age in which there is a certain foreboding about the future. More troubling is the apprehension that the current crisis has an air of longevity about it, constituting what I think is almost an irreversible turning point in history. The good news is that the pandemic has revealed in all of its ugliness the death-producing mechanisms of institutional racism, the increasingly dangerous assault on the environment, and an anti-intellectual culture that derives any notion of dissent or critical education. That is, an education that equips individuals to think critically, be provocative, engage in thoughtful dialogue, learn the lessons of history, and develop the capacity to hold power accountable. The ugliness of raw and oppressive power can no longer hide in the shadows. The pandemic has torn away the cover of a neoliberal economic system marked by what Thomas Piketty calls the violence of social inequality. It's hard to imagine a more urgent moment for taking seriously ongoing attempts to make education central to politics. At stake here is the notion that education is a social concept rooted in the goal of emancipation for all people. Moreover, this is an education that is not content to encourage simply critical thinking, but also to inspire and energize individuals to become engaged social agents. That's the difference between critical thinking and critical consciousness. This is a pedagogy that calls us beyond ourselves and engages the ethical imperative to care for others, dismantle structures of domination, and to become a subject rather than an object of history, an object of politics, or an object of power. Pedagogy, in this sense, should provide the knowledge, the tools, and the values that enable people to be governed rather than be governed. If we're going to develop a politics capable of awakening our critical, imaginative, and historical sensibilities, it would seem to me it's crucial for educators and others to reclaim matters of civic literacy, civic courage, and the ethical and political demands that sustain a substantive democracy. Moreover, it's crucial in a time of violence to teach the practice of freedom and not just to make an appeal to the truth. This is a political project in which civic literacy, infused with the language of critique and possibility, takes seriously the notion that there is no democracy without informed citizens. Such a language is necessary to enable the conditions to forge a collective international resistance among educators, youth, artists, and other cultural workers in defense of public goods and radical democracy itself. Such a movement is important to resist and overcome the tyrannical fascist nightmares that have descended upon the United States, Brazil, and a number of other countries in Europe, plagued by right-wing populist movements and neo-Nazi parties. In an age of social isolation and information overflow, a culture of immediacy, consumer glut, and spectacularized violence, it's all the more crucial to take seriously the notion that democracy cannot exist or be defended without institutions and ideas that uphold and develop the capacities to think critically and to act with a degree of ethical and social responsibility. In this sense, politics becomes educative, changing the way people see things while awakening more critical modes of identification. One crucial pedagogical lesson to remember is that fascism begins with hateful words, the demonization of others considered disposable, and moves on to attack ideas, the burning of books, the disappearance of intellectuals, and the emergence of the carceral state and the horrors of detention jails and camps. As a form of cultural politics, critical pedagogy should provide the promise of a protected space in which to think against the grain of received opinion and hold power accountable. This is a space to question and challenge, to imagine the world from different standpoints and perspectives, to reflect upon what it means in relation to others, the larger world, and in doing so, to understand what it means to assume a sense of social and political responsibility. This is a space in which education can no longer insist on the importance of methods or training in a time of legitimized violence. This is a particularly important issue, given the fact that those of us who work in education are now sort of overwrought with a kind of managerial ethos that borders on the most inane stupidity, that it's hard to imagine that it has anything to do with education except to destroy it. Education, both in its symbolic and institutional forms, has a central role to play in fighting the emergence of fascist cultures, mythic historical narratives, and the emerging ideologies of white supremacy and white nationalism. Moreover, as neo-fascist white militia groups and other right-wing extremists across the globe are disseminating toxic, racist, and ultra-nationalist images of the past, it's essential to reclaim critical pedagogy as a form of historical consciousness and moral witnessing. Education as a form of cultural work extends far beyond the classroom, and its pedagogical influence, while often imperceptible, is crucial to challenging and resisting the rise of fascist pedagogical formations and their rehabilitation of fascist principles and ideas. This is especially true at a time when historical and social amnesia have become a national pastime, matched by the masculinization of the public sphere and the increasing rise of extremist politics that thrives on ignorance, the suppression of dissent, and violence. It is crucial for educators to remember that language is not simply an instrument of fear, violence, and intimidation. It's also a vehicle for critique, civic courage, resistance, and engaged and informed agency. We live at a time when language and what I call the dreamscapes of democracy have been pillaged, stripped of their promise and hopes. And if fascism is to be defeated, or fascist politics, there's a need to make education an organizing principle of politics. And in part, this can be done with a language that exposes and unravels falsehoods, systems of oppression, and corrupt relations of power, while making clear that an alternative future is possible. Hannah Arendt was right in arguing that language is crucial to highlight the often hidden, crystallized elements that make fascism likely. Paul Giroux correctly argues that it is crucial in the current historical moment to re-engage with fascism in order to address how it is crystallized in different forms, and in doing so, work towards redeeming the term from its trivialization and restoring it to its proper place in a discussion of the moral and political limits of what is acceptable. Fascism is never entirely relegated to the past, and while it may go into remission, it never entirely disappears. What is clear in the current moment is that the conditions that produce totalitarian forms are with us once again, appearing in different forms across the globe. Think Trump, think Bolsonaro, think Erdogan. In the face of the current COVID-19 crisis, pandemic, matters of criticism, informed judgments, and critical modes of understanding are crucial in making a choice between democracy, authoritarianism, life, and death. The stock choices regarding what the future might look like appears to hang between the forces of despotism and democracy. Yet, as ominous as this, it seems to me, appears, history is open, and how it will unfold hangs in the balance. The pandemic is a crisis that cannot be allowed to turn into a catastrophe in which all hope is lost. Education operates as a crucial site of power in the modern world. And it seems to me that if educators and other cultural workers are truly concerned about safeguarding education, they'll have to take seriously how pedagogy functions on local and global levels. Critical pedagogy has an important role to play in both understanding and challenging how power, knowledge, and values are deployed, affirmed, and resisted within and outside modes of traditional discourse and cultural spheres. In taking up this project, educators and others should attempt to create the conditions that give students, for instance, the opportunity to become critically engaged citizens who have the knowledge and the courage to struggle in order to make desolation and cynicism unconvincing and hope practical. They should also organize nationally and across borders with broader social movements to reclaim their power as educators and define higher education as a democratic public sphere, because increasingly it's defined, as we all know, as basically a corporation. Hope in this instance is educational and active, removed from the fantasy of an idealism that is unaware of the constraints facing the dream of a radical democratic society. The current fight against nascent fascism across the globe is not only a struggle over economic structures or the commanding heights of corporate power, it's also a struggle over visions, ideas, consciousness, and the power to shift culture itself. It's also, as Hannah Arendt points out, a struggle against a widespread fear of judging. Without the ability to judge, it becomes impossible to recover words that have meaning. Imagine a future that does not mimic the dark times in which we live, and create a language that changes how we think about ourselves and our relationship to others. In the end, there's no democracy without informed citizens, and no justice without a language critical of injustice. Democracy begins to fail, and political life becomes impoverished in the absence of those vital political spheres and elements of civic culture, such as the arts and higher education, not to mention public education, that produce civic values, public scholarship, and forms of social engagement that allow for a more imaginative grasp of the future, one that allows us to think otherwise in order to act otherwise. Democracy should be a way of thinking about education, one that thrives on connecting pedagogy to the practice of freedom, learning to ethics, and agency to the imperatives of social responsibility and the public good. Without hope, there is no agency, and without collective agents, there's no hope of resistance. In the age of nascent extremism, it's not enough to connect education with the defense of reason, informed judgment, and critical education. It must also be aligned with the power and potential of collective resistance. We live in dangerous times, making it all the more urgent for individuals, labor unions, and social movements to come together in the belief that the current regimes of tyranny can be resisted, that alternative futures are possible, and that acting on these beliefs through collective resistance will make radical change happen. Democracy needs a vision rooted in a deep politics of solidarity that enables people to fight against the forces of authoritarianism and to overcome them. Resistance is no longer an option. It's a necessity. Goya was right when he warned, the sleep of reason produces monsters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. That was wonderful, very thought-provoking keynotes and deeply provocative as well. Thank you very much. I'm going to open up the floor now to questions, and I'd like anybody who would like to pose a question